Hello everybody, and welcome to today's webinar, which is hosted by the PREFER Consortium. My name is Rosanne Janssens, and I will moderate today's session. I'm a PhD researcher working at the University of Leuven, and I am also involved in the PREFER project, leading an academic case study. So what are patient preferences, and what are methods to elicit and understand patient preferences? What is the potential value of patient preferences in a medical product life cycle? Who are the different stakeholders involved, and how can they benefit from patient preferences? These questions will be answered during today's webinar. So first of all, we have Professor Isabelle Huys. She is the academic PREFER deputy coordinator working at the University of Leuven. She's there a full-time professor in regulatory sciences, and she's also co-leading the work package 4 of PREFER, developing the recommendations. And her presentation will provide you with a basic understanding of patient preference studies and methodologies. Then we have the presentation by Monika Brand and Dr. Mireille Mueller. Monika Brand works for Janssen Pharmaceuticals, where she is a global epidemiology director as a group lead of the pharmacovigilance and real-world data epicenter. In PREFER, she co-leads the sustainability work stream. Then Dr. Mireille Mueller, who will perform the joint presentation with Monika Brand, is currently a regulatory affairs, policy and intelligence director at Novartis, where she focuses on clinical trials and advanced therapy, medicinal products, and personalized medicines. And in PREFER, she also co-leads the PREFER Work Package 4 as a private co-lead, focusing also on developing the recommendations. Then we have, so Monika and Mireille will both, during their presentation, explain how patient preference studies can be used to inform the choice of clinical trial endpoints and regulatory benefit risk assessments of medicinal products. Then we have a presentation by Irina Cleemput. She is a scientific program director at the Belgian Healthcare Knowledge Center, the HTA body in Belgium. She's co-leading also work package 4 of PREFER on recommendations, and aside from that, she also coordinates the HTA and payer stakeholder advisory within PREFER. She will speak during her presentation about the potential value of patient preference studies in health technology assessment. Finally, in my presentation, I will speak about stakeholder needs towards using patient preference studies across the drug life cycle. So hereby, I end the brief introduction, and I give the words to Professor Isabelle Huys.
Thanks, Rosanne, for this very nice introduction. I think I will just start with giving a few words about what is PREFER, IMI PREFER. So IMI PREFER is a public-private partnership between profit and non-profit entities or institutions, where we have the industry, like large pharmaceutical companies, but also smaller companies that collaborate with academic institutions, health technology agencies, patient organizations, in order to find out methodologies about how to measure and how to implement methodologies on patient preferences, and how these patient preferences can be measured, but also implemented in decision-making. And the ultimate aim of PREFER is to guide industry, regulatory authorities, HTA bodies, reimbursement agencies with their decisions on in different institutions that they have, and to guide them on how to measure patient preferences, how they can be assessed, and how they can be used to inform medical product decision-making. With the aim also for them to further develop evidence-based recommendations based on what the insights of PREFER reveal. PREFER is a project that started in 2016 with a work package that focused on finding out more about patient preference methodologies. We did a lot of interviews, a lot of focus group discussions and reveals therefore lots of insights about stakeholders and what are their needs. We will hear much about this later by Rosanne. After that work, we selected certain patient preference methodologies that were further on used into concrete case studies. PREFER is conducting and has conducted several case studies in different disease areas. And these case studies are still going on, and certain have been finalized already and are at the point of analysis. At the same time, we have been involved in an IMI qualification procedure, which is also a procedure that is going on in order to involve also to get also the approval for this patient preference study at the IMI level. And as we are in a COVID time, indeed, we had a very difficult time also for PREFER. However, we managed to continue all our case studies, most of the case studies, and we aim to draft our recommendations by the end of March 2022. But what are these patient preferences in the end? So there are different concepts that circulate, which are all related to the term patient preferences. Think about patient-reported outcomes. People sometimes confuse patient preferences with patient-reported outcomes, but patient-reported outcomes are more data that are collected on the health status of a particular patient directly from these patients, so without any comparison with the alternatives. Whereas patient preferences, as we use in PREFER, are more referred to qualitative and quantitative assessments of the relative desirability and acceptability to patients of specific alternatives or choices. Among the outcomes are other attributes that differ among alternative health interventions. And here the term attributes is a particular important one. So it's really about what is the relative desirability and acceptability of patients of different attributes that are related to a particular health intervention. And attributes are characteristics, features related to these interventions or disease states. These can be benefits related to that, for instance, the relief of pain, or risks related to a particular health intervention, for instance, the loss of hair, risk of having a loss of hair, or uncertainties related to it. For instance, what are the long-term health safety risks that are related to a particular treatment? Or even other aspects which we are in need of, for instance, certain types of information that is or is not available. And all these aspects are important for different stakeholders to take decisions across the drug life cycle. Here you see these different stakeholders that can make use of patient preferences in their decision-making context. For instance, at the level of discovery, at the level of preclinical development, also during clinical development, marketing authorization. Think of decisions at the European Medicines Agency or at the FDA. Health technology agencies or reimbursement agencies. Here you see the KCE, which is the partner in our project. Or at the post-marketing authorization level. And what type of decisions are these then? Well, it can be about decisions related to defining the relative clinical trial endpoint selections, or about the patient-reported outcome measures development itself. It can also be decisions which are related to benefit risk assessments or labeling or early access. And on a general level, patient preferences might inform decision-making, especially those decisions that are patient preference sensitive. So we call them patient preference sensitive situations or patient preference sensitive decisions. And what are then patient preference sensitive decisions or situations? These are situations where there's really a need for the patient's view. For instance, about the most important attributes, benefits, risks, modes of administrations of a particular disease, of a particular medicinal product. That might be one situation. Another situation can be when multiple treatment options exist and no option is clearly superior for all the patients that we have in our mind. And then it might also be a preference-sensitive situation, so a situation where patient preferences might really have value, where there is really an uncertainty, or where where there is indeed evidence that support one option over the other, and whether that is uncertain or variable, and where there is really a need to understand what is the patient's tolerance for that uncertainty. And lastly, there is also a situation where there might be a need to investigate further the heterogeneity among different patients' views in a population. And so we need to take care about these situations, and especially there, the generation of information about patient preference is valuable. And how do we do this? We do this based on or using or setting up patient preference studies. So patient preference studies are studies that are characteristically or typically set up in different steps. There is a design step of a patient preference study. There is the conduct step, so the point where we conduct the study, execute the study. And then we have the point where we communicate about the results of this patient preference study. And indeed, all these aspects need to be organized adequately. And that's also something which need to be taken into account. So patient preference studies typically consist of a qualitative phase and a quantitative phase. And we think of, when we talk about the qualitative phase, patient preference studies make use of qualitative methods, literature reviews, focus groups, interviews, depending on the setup, depending on the type of population, a group of population that we need to target. And at the qualitative level, we want to investigate what do patients find important treatment attributes. And not only what, but also why. And the moment we have that, this may inform the more quantitative phase of the study, which might be a survey, discrete choice experiment, or a swing weighting type of exercise, where we want to investigate, okay, how much do patients now value these attributes, and what are the trade-offs that these patients are willing to make between these attributes? And how do preferences differ according to the different characteristics that all these patients have in our sample? What is the patient heterogeneity? So for this quantitative part, the aim is really to quantify, to give patient preference weights, relative importance of the attributes determination. What is the maximal acceptable risk or the minimum acceptable benefit that patients need in order to accept a certain risk, for instance? And for that, we also target a larger group of patients compared to the qualitative part in order to reach significant results. So this is actually, in a nutshell, what are patient preference studies, how you can set them up, is something which we in Prefer work further out, and which you can also hear in subsequent webinars in the future. With that, I stop with giving this small introduction, and I am happy to give now further the words to Monika Brand and Mireille Mueller, who will talk about value of patient preferences and regulatory decision-making.
Thank you very much. Monika, if we can go to the next slide. So to elaborate further on what Isabelle just said, patient input is very broad and general. It can include many aspects that is coming from the patients, including patient opinions expressed publicly, including via social media, and other ways of collecting what patients are experiencing. The patient's perspective is more how the patient is expressing its experience with a disease or condition, and how he's coping with this disease or condition. If we go back then to what Isabelle just said, patient-reported outcome is complementary to patient preferences. It measures how the patient is feeling with a given treatment. And patient preferences is going one level deeper and is asking, how does patient A make me feel compared to treatment B? How can what is my preference between treatment A and treatment B? So with that, I hand over to Monika, who is presenting the next slides.
Thank you very much, Mireille. And yeah, let's go to the next slide. And the next slide is talking, or is getting us back again to a slide that Isabelle showed, where we are in PREFER. So just as a reminder, PREFER is coming to its end. Next year, in 2022, PREFER will be finalized. And actually, now it's important to see, how does it help to improve the future? What is the impact for the future? And if we take the picture of a house, we can see that PREFER builds a foundation with providing outcome documents, for example, recommendations on how to do preference studies, what's important. Then there's an operational guide. There are training materials as well as supportive documents. And how can these things help? Well, they should help to increase the number of patient preference studies to be conducted in the life cycle of the medical product decision making. So whenever, in our case, we are talking about the interactions with regulatories, whenever there is an interaction between industry and regulatory, then preference studies may play a role, and the foundation of PREFER will help to do and to provide best practice in conducting the preference studies. With this, we ensure there's good implementation of preference studies, but on a different, on the next step, it also continues to enhance the field of patient preference studies based on what PREFER provided. Going to the next slide, let's talk about how patient preference studies inform the medical product decision making. And as I said, we are talking here about the interactions between industry and regulators. And a main topic to discuss between these two partners is the choice of patient-relevant endpoints. Why is this important? The patient-relevant endpoints will help to inform the clinical trials. And how can patient preference inform these patient-relevant endpoints? Well, patient preference studies help to measure the what and the how much is it important to patients. So with this, it's not only that one informs one product, potentially one informs a whole disease area, because usually you have more products for one disease area, and the patient preference studies support to develop the patient-relevant endpoints, which are then relevant to all products which will come up in the future. And then the regulators, they use patient preference to make the decision on the key endpoints when they make a benefit-risk assessment. So patient-relevant endpoints and the benefit-risk trade-off, these are two very key elements for patient preference studies in the clinical development program. And the next slide will show where these patient preference studies will sit. Here on this slide, we display the clinical development program for a new product. So the phase 1 study is when a compound comes first into man. That means here volunteers will be in a clinical trial to get a first information on the safety of the product. Then it goes to the phase 2, where safety and efficacy get studied on small numbers of patients. Phase 3, same questions, but in a far larger number of patients. Then it comes hopefully to an approval for the compound. And the phase 4 is basically everything that happens after it is approved by the FDA and the IMA, as mentioned by Isabelle earlier. And then there are also studies to to study further the safety of the compound within a broad group of patients. So now let's come to where patient input sits. We saw from Mireille the nice picture about patient input, which is a broad way of getting information, and a patient preference is one piece of that. If you think of phase 1 and 2, there's probably the qualitative information of relevance. Here, the patient input comes through individuals, through literature, social media, and qualitative research like the focused in-depth interviews, as mentioned. They also happened in PREFER. And all these information will be discussed between industry and regulators. There are always touch points to see how to move forward and then to find the most relevant, the key patient relevant endpoint. And this is then also in phase 2, all the way to the approval, where the industry and regulators talk a lot about what are the key endpoints. There's then the quantitative research that helps to understand the what and the how much it matters. There are treatment effects which get evaluated in the phase 3 clinical trials. And then with having the treatment effects as much as how much it is important for a patient, one can start to do the benefit risk assessment. So to understand what is the acceptability of a certain risk against a certain benefit. And this is what all goes in the documents that will lead to an approval. And when then an approval is given, it's not stopping. The relevant endpoints remain to be critical, and patient preference remain to be important to continue the support of studies in so-called post-authorization safety studies, in benefit risk assessment, in medical product class reviews. So what you can see from this picture throughout the entire life cycle of the clinical development programs and the approval process, patient preference studies can play a very important role to support the decision-making. And with this, I hand over again to Mireille.
Yes, thank you very much, Monika. So what are the main applications for patient preferences in regulatory decision-making? As we saw just from Monika, it's really important that in very early development, we engage with regulators before doing a patient preference study on why we would do so. There are many conditions where the symptoms are either ignored by the healthcare professionals, or the importance of the symptoms is not ranked as high as it should be. Being a patient myself, I had to live with a condition which was completely underreported. It's only once the symptoms were extremely high that it was actually acknowledged. So that's also an important message to share with the regulators. And how this will impact the decision itself. So when we go one step further during marketing authorization, here the choice of endpoints, as we saw from Monika, is quite important to be discussed, and how these will be impacting the outcome of the regulatory decision making, how they contribute to the key benefits of a treatment. So this is really very important. It complements, of course, clinical evidence. There should be always a balance between the two. And then it is important to understand also the benefit-risk trade-offs, and how patients would be ready to accept uncertainty in their treatment. If you have a severe condition, what would you be ready to accept, for example, compared to quality of life? These are important decisions which need to be made aware and need to be raised at the regulatory level. And when to start this dialogue with the regulators, of course, this needs to start very early on at a scientific advice level. And this happens throughout the life cycle of a product, so prior and during marketing authorization, as Monika just showed us, and it doesn't end. We have, thank God, a good post-marketing surveillance in Europe, and there are also mechanisms where patient preferences can be integrated to improve this post-marketing surveillance, and how it can help to shape a better inclusion of patients' voice. The PREFER framework is the one element that will help to guide what is the study purpose and how the research question should be framed and discussed. So if we go the next, this is the next slide. And here we will be discussing how the framework is structuring the dialogue on the framework. So first we start with the planning of first the setup of a study, how the study purpose is defined, what will be the study objectives. And then we go to the planning of the study, discussing the details, the logistics of the study setup, and then finally going into the design, and which is giving in a very practical way how to calculate how many patients do we need to have a representative sample size, which method we would be selecting, etc. So these are important elements. And then finally, we do the actual study. We first pilot, and then we recruit the patients. We gather the data from the patients and analyze them. And finally, we have to report the results of this study. And these results need also to be shared in full transparency with the patients. And then finally, applying these patient preferences in informing decision-making. So that's it on my end. I leave it now to Irina.
Do you see my screen?
Yes.
It's not in presenter mode, I suppose.
No.
No, it's not in presenter.
Now it is.
Now it is, yes.
Okay, thank you. So thank you. As already announced by Rosanne, I will try to explain to you how PREFER sees the potential role of patient preference studies in HTA, health technology assessment. This is a brief outline of my talk today. So first, I will try to respond to the question, what can we learn from patient preference studies? And why is this relevant for health technology assessment? How can patient preference data be used in health technology assessment? Should we use patient preferences or public preferences? I think this is a very crucial question in HTA. And then finally, I will talk about an unresolved issue and suggested solution for the inclusion of patient preferences in health technology assessment. So what can we learn from patient preference studies? This is actually something that has been referred to several times before by the previous speakers. So we can learn from patient preferences what matters to patients, how much these things matter to patients, and what matters most. So which kind of trade-offs are patients prepared to make? And why is this relevant for HTA? Before diving into this question, I would like to describe very briefly again what the objective of HTA is and what HTA bodies actually do. So the objective of health technology assessment is to support reimbursement decision makers by means of a full overview of the scientific evidence with respect to a healthcare intervention. This can be a medicinal product, this can be a medical device, or this can be any other type of health intervention. So what we do first is to collect all the available evidence, and evidence is scientific evidence derived from clinical trials or from scientific studies, and we make a critical assessment of this evidence, for instance, on safety and effectiveness, but also on the cost effectiveness of medical interventions. And we also try to find out what specific patient and social issues are that are related to the healthcare interventions, as well as any legal, ethical, and organizational aspects. So the objective is really to try to give an all-encompassing view on what do we know currently about this health intervention and this health technology, and how can this inform the decision makers. So this already demonstrates that health technology assessment bodies are working in a broader societal context, and we constantly need to balance individual patient needs against societal needs. Individual needs are not always going in the same direction as the societal needs. And just to give one example, you can have an individual illness or health condition for which there is a treatment, but it's a very expensive treatment, and it costs about 300,000 euros per treatment per year per patient. Then you have a potential societal problem if this concerns many patients. So we constantly have to balance these individual and societal needs in health technology assessments. So then the crucial question, where do patient preferences come into the picture in health technology assessment? If we consider the decision-making process regarding the reimbursement of a new health intervention, we could roughly subdivide this decision-making process into 5 different questions. The first question is, does this product or does this health intervention actually target a therapeutic or societal need? Therapeutic need refers to the individual need of patients, the patient's need from the individual perspective. Societal need obviously refers to the need from the societal point of view. It is clear, obviously, that for the assessment of therapeutic need, we need to question patients about what matters to them. So given what they get already now, given their current treatment, what are their remaining unmet needs? What are their needs, and what are the most important needs? So this is the first place where patient preference studies come into play and where they could provide input into the health technology assessment process. For societal needs, on the other hand, we would not go for patient preference studies, but we need societal preferences. The second question that we ask when we are making a decision about the reimbursement of a health technology is, are we as a society prepared to pay for this treatment out of public resources? Again, are we as a society prepared to pay for something? Therefore, we need societal values. Then the next question is, are we as a society prepared to pay for this particular treatment? Of course, whether a new treatment is worth its money, its value for money, depends on its relative effectiveness assessment. Relative effectiveness assessment compares the effectiveness, the effects of the new treatment with what is already available or with the current standard of care. And for this, of course, it is very important to take into account what matters to patients and what matters most to them, because you can perfectly have a new treatment that shows good effectiveness on certain outcomes, but if these outcomes don't matter to patients, or if they do not matter a lot to patients, then the relative effectiveness of this new treatment is rather low. And then you would rather say, okay, if this costs so much more, then we are not willing to pay for it because it's not meeting the patient's needs. So we need information on patient preferences to address the relative effectiveness assessment and to perform an appropriate relative effectiveness assessment. And then finally, the final two questions are related to, are we prepared to pay more for this treatment than for the current alternative, and how much more are we willing to pay? And this again is a question where societal preferences come into the picture, especially when these questions are addressed by means of cost effectiveness analysis that require comparisons between interventions for many different diseases. So I again refer to the same picture that you have seen before to address the specific question of how patient preferences can be used in health technology assessment. And we see two main applications, or we emphasize two main applications in PREFER. That is to identify patients' unmet needs. This identification of unmet needs can inform the choice of the clinical trial endpoints, which should actually be product independent, because patient needs should be as before the new treatment is implemented. So you need to know what matters most to patients, independent of the new product or the new health intervention that is being introduced and for which a decision about reimbursement has to be taken. This information, if it is used appropriately in the clinical trials to measure the endpoints that matter most to patients, can subsequently be used in the HTA process in the relative effectiveness assessment. So here you will then look at the performance of the new treatment and also of the current treatment on these outcomes that matter most to patients to make an appropriate relative effectiveness assessment, focusing on the aspects or the outcomes that matter most to patients. So it's really patient-centered decision-making approach. I just want to illustrate how this would work in a relative effectiveness assessment. Suppose, for instance, that you do a patient preference study on a particular disease, and you find that patients have four main concerns, that is fatigue, hair loss, nausea, and treatment burden. These are considered to be the most important endpoints for patients. They want to see improvement on these four criteria, these four attributes, whenever a new treatment is coming to the market. So these are clearly disease-specific attributes for which you need patient preferences, not only to identify them, but also to make an assessment of the relative importance of these attributes. You need patient preference data for that. But of course, this is really an individual focused or individual disease focused approach. And as I said before, HTA needs to take the broader societal perspective. So while the focus of one single health technology is on one particular intervention, the scope of HTA is always larger. We need to take into account the fact that resources in healthcare are limited, and we need to allocate resources in the best way possible. The way this is actually tackled very often in health technology assessment is by means of health economic evaluations, cost effectiveness analysis, but you can do this in different ways. And so I think that the people who know or who have inside knowledge on HTA in the audience will question themselves, yeah, but what about the inclusion or the incorporation of patient preference data in cost effectiveness analysis? Do we want that? Or is this not appropriate? Should we use public values for that? We have considered this question in PREFER, and we think that there are actually, you need to make a distinction between two different approaches, two different systems that are currently being applied in Europe in different countries. On the one hand, some HTA agencies would only make within indication assessments, which means that actually what they do is they look at the health interventions for one specific indication and try to allocate the resources efficiently within that indication. So they try to find the best allocation of available resources for treating that indication by selecting the intervention with the lowest incremental cost effectiveness ratio. So the one intervention that offers the best outcome for a given amount of resources within that indication. But other healthcare systems, like for instance the UK, they say that you need to do cost effectiveness analysis to be able to allocate your resources within the healthcare system efficiently. So you need to compare the cost effectiveness of treatments for very diverse diseases in order to obtain the maximal amount or the maximal health for the society as a whole. This has implications for the type of outcomes that you can use in your incremental cost effectiveness ratio, as demonstrated within the next two slides. For instance, take the first system where you only make within indication assessments and you try to allocate resources for your indication efficiently. In that case, you can actually use the attributes that have been identified as being most important by patients with that indication. So you look at what patients highlight as being the most important elements they want to see improved in their treatment or in their disease, and you can use these in your relative effectiveness and cost effectiveness assessment for that treatment. And this is, of course, based on information from patient preferences. But if you want to make comparisons between different diseases and so between different indications, you cannot use that approach. You cannot use disease-specific attributes because, for instance, the attributes or what matters to diabetes patients is, of course, not the same as what matters most to lung cancer patients. So in this case, you need to focus on generic attributes, generic outcome measures, like, for instance, what is the impact on the life expectancy? What is the impact on health-related quality of life? Where health-related quality of life can be further specified in a number of generic dimensions as well. And in this case, very often also, you will not use patient preference data, but public preference data, because you need comparability between the different patient populations. So in conclusion, and this is my final slide, when we look back at the different dimensions and different domains of health technology assessment, we see a couple of areas where patient preferences can indeed inform the assessments, like, for instance, the assessment of patient needs, relative effectiveness assessment, and patient's issues. These are obvious. For cost effectiveness assessment, it really depends on in which type of system you're working. It can be within indications or between indications, and depending on what type of system, you either need patient or public preference data. For the organizational aspect, probably both are relevant. Patients can have clear preferences on how to organize their care, but there are also societal implications on the organization of care, for which you might need to collect public preferences. And then finally, for the societal needs, it's public preferences that will be used. With this, I would like to finalize my presentation and hand over to Rosanne. Thank you for your attention.
So, hello everyone. So this is Rosanne Janssens speaking. Can you see my screen?
Yes, that's all fine.
Okay. So thanks a lot for here being able to present on stakeholders' needs towards patient preference studies across the drug life cycle. So before we talk about what are the stakeholders' needs regarding patient preference studies, I think it's important to understand who are we actually talking about, who are the key players in a medicinal product life cycle that may use patient preference studies, and why is it relevant to understand their needs regarding this type of research. So here on the slide, you see that there are actually several stakeholders involved in the development and evaluation of medicinal products. And what are they deciding about regarding regarding medicinal products? So although all of these stakeholders very much, their decisions are very much interlinked and they have roles across the drug life cycle, I here situate them a little bit across where their main decisions lie in the drug life cycle. So when we look, for example, at regulatory bodies such as the European Medicines Agency or the US Food and Drug Administration, they look at the marketing authorization level. So they look at whether or not to authorize a medicinal product, whether or not it can become available on the market. Before that, before a drug is evaluated for marketing authorization, we look at the key players who are industry, so drug developers who are in fact starting the development of a drug, and often collaborate or often also rely on academical research and academics who initiate or have a basic discovery regarding drugs to be developed, and often also collaborate on early drug development. Following the authorization of a medicinal product, it's also important that the medical product is being reimbursed so that patients do not need to pay the entire price of the medicinal product themselves. And this is a decision that is made by what Irina already has very extensively described. So the health technology assessment and the reimbursement phase. So these are HTA bodies who make a national decision, so in each country specifically, on whether or not a drug can become available or can be reimbursed for patients. And then at the post-marketing level, following the reimbursement decision, here it comes really down to the individual treatment decisions. So actually patients are here the key stakeholder who decides often in consultation with the physician, very often actually, on whether or not they will take a specific treatment. And how can patient preference studies inform the decisions by all of these different stakeholders involved? Actually, like already highlighted by the different presenters today, we develop preference studies so that they can inform all of these different stakeholders regarding what are patient views on what matters most to them. So this information on what matters to patients can be used before starting the development of a product. So what are the symptoms, the outcomes, the endpoint actually are most important to patients, can already be included before even starting to think about a treatment that targets these relevant aspects to patients. But also, as highlighted in the presentation by Mireille and Monika before, this understanding of what endpoints and outcomes are most important to patients supports regulators when they evaluate what is the relevance of the endpoints that were targeted during the clinical development of a drug. So how much do these endpoints actually matter to the patients who will take eventually the drug? As well as described by Irina, also in relative relative effectiveness assessments during HTA, so health technology assessments. Also, HTA bodies need to understand what is the relevance of a certain endpoint, a certain treatment feature. And this is also information that can be provided by a patient preference study. And finally, this is something we have not talked about before, but also in the post-marketing phase, patient preference studies can inform the development of shared decision-making tools between patients and physicians, so to tailor the individual treatment decision according to the patient needs, what he thinks are the most important treatment attributes, and align this decision actually with what this patient thinks is most important to them. So why are we looking at these stakeholders' needs in PREFER? So did we investigate them, and why do we consider them very important? So first of all, as extensively described before, patient preference studies, we do not conduct them just merely out of an academic interest. There really is the intention to use this information across the drug life cycle, early on until post-marketing level, to inform decision-making by these different stakeholders. As I mentioned before, the stakeholder decisions also depend on one another. So, for example, the selection of a clinical trial endpoint that is relevant to patients, and this decision is made early on and during the clinical development path by industry, but then afterwards also evaluated by regulators and HTA bodies. So these decisions depend on one another. So if the stakeholders would use patient preference studies to inform their decisions, that would impact also the other stakeholders who will be looking at the preference data, for example, submitted to the regulatory bodies and HTA bodies. So because preference studies are intended to inform their decisions, we need to look at these stakeholders, because whether or not they agree with the value, or whether or not they think the methodologies are robust, will actually affect whether or not they will use patient preference studies to inform their decisions. And finally, within PREFER, we investigated their needs, and we take into consideration their needs throughout the entire project, and to ensure that the recommendations that are developed by PREFER are considerate of what stakeholders need regarding patient preference studies. So we believe that if we understand what are the needs of these stakeholders with respect to patient preference studies, and we include these needs when developing recommendations regarding preference studies, that then the recommendations eventually found will be more relevant for these different stakeholders. So how did we investigate what are the stakeholders' needs regarding patient preference studies? So in the initial phase of PREFER, we conducted a large qualitative study among the different stakeholders I briefly described. And this started off with exploratory interviews to reveal what are the topics of their concern, or what are their overarching views, just in a very limited amount of people. And then we also performed a systematic literature review to further detail on what has been described in the literature, what has been known regarding patient preference studies and described already before. And these topics we further included in qualitative individual interviews with these stakeholders. So where we included the different stakeholder groups, so regulators, drug developers, patient organizations, patients, clinicians, HTA bodies and payers, and where we really wanted to learn from them via an open interview, what do they need with regards to patient preference studies. And finally, we also conducted focus group discussions to reveal more about topics that we did not fully capture or fully understood during the interviews. And here in the focus group discussions, we wanted to detail more about specific aspects. And then next to these qualitative interviews and this qualitative study, we also revealed the needs of stakeholders throughout the PREFER case, the PREFER project entirely. So as we in PREFER involve heavily different stakeholders, so regulatory bodies as well as HTA bodies and payers in the stakeholder advisory groups, we also reveal what are their questions concerning preference studies throughout this engagement in the PREFER project. So here, what do these stakeholders actually discuss during these qualitative interviews, and what did we find out during our experience within PREFER? So they actually want to learn more about and generate insights about different aspects concerning preference studies. And this can be divided into 4 overarching themes. So first aspect they wanted to have more insights about is the design and conduct of preference studies. So how to delineate an adequately designed and conducted preference studies. And within this team, there are several more specific questions regarding the methods and the methodology and the conduct of preference studies. So for example, how can we in patient preference studies ensure that participants understand what we are asking to them? How can we select an appropriate method to use in patient preference studies? How should we ensure that the patient sample that we include is representative of the patient population, etc. A second theme relates to the organization of preference studies. So stakeholders, aside from the methodological aspect, were also wondering about more really practical things. So for example, how much time does it take to conduct a patient preference studies? And then from the drug developer perspective, for example, when should we start thinking about patient preference studies during the development of our drugs? And also in relation to when we want to submit a dossier for regulatory approval, how much in advance should we start thinking about it? And this has been touched upon before, ideally as early as possible. But also, do we need to have an ethical approval for conducting patient preference studies? How do we go about this? What is the cost of doing a patient preference study? What are the requirements regarding translation of preference studies if we want to involve patients or include patients from different countries into our preference studies, etc. Another theme relates to the communication regarding patient preference studies. So stakeholders wondered how to communicate actually about patient preference studies. As highlighted in earlier presentations, it's really important to communicate about preference studies towards all of the stakeholders involved so that they are aware of the results. But how should we go practically about it? Specifically towards patients, we need to ensure that the results are rendered back to the patient community. But how should we tailor this communication towards patients? What to communicate to patients, and also how should we involve patients to ensure that this communication is tailored towards their needs. A final theme relates to increasing the familiarity regarding patient preference studies, and also a need to get concrete insights into how patient preference studies can be used in current decision-making frameworks. And this has been described extensively by the presentations, the earlier presentations. And specific questions that stakeholders had here is regarding their own familiarity. So how can we increase our own familiarity, proved to be an important barrier towards using preference studies? Should we use patient preferences in all of the decisions that we make? As highlighted by Irina as well, how to use or weigh them in comparison to societal and caregiver preferences? As well as how can we use them and incorporate them alongside other evidence from clinical trials. So the takeaways from our qualitative study and our experience through PREFER is that patient preference studies are intended to inform decisions by all stakeholders across the drug life cycle on what matters to patients, how much these aspects matter to patients, and the trade-offs that patients are willing to make. Another takeaway is that stakeholders require evidence-based insights from the PREFER project, but also outside, to answer their questions, so to generate more knowledge regarding how to appropriately and robustly design, conduct, and organize preference studies, and how to communicate about them towards other stakeholders. And within PREFER, we think that answering these stakeholders' questions throughout the development of the PREFER recommendations will increase not only familiarity across stakeholders, but also the uptake and the relevance of the recommendations for these stakeholders.